Rachel Anderson. I am a AAAS fellow at the National Institutes of Health and former fellow here at NIJ. And I've really appreciated listening to your discussion this morning. One thing that I didn't hear anyone mention was substance abuse. And I'm sure most people here have the sense that coping with stress and trauma is often cited as a factor that drives alcohol and other substance use. And in particular, chronic alcohol use dysregulates brain stress systems and exacerbates symptoms of stress-related disorders like PTSD. So I'm hoping that some of you might have some comments on the need or experiences that you've had with preventive efforts or treatment interventions for substance abuse for individuals in this high-stress profession.
That's my day-to-day. So here's the deal with substance abuse. It's a symptom. And often agencies focus on the symptom. I know you probably never heard of it, but there's been a cop once or twice get a DUI. We immediately treat that as, oh my God, he messed up or she messed up, blah, blah, blah. We're not asking the right questions. We should be asking, wait a minute, why at 10 o'clock in the morning did this officer crash his car and is drunk? Why? And that's the trauma-informed, not what's wrong with him, but what's happened to get us to this point. The big thing with substance abuse is that there's such a stigma associated with it and in getting treatment, but that's not even the worst of it. We don't have the facilities or we don't have the knowledge of where to go when we need to get help. There's a great example of an individual, an officer that came to me. We went to his house at about 3 in the morning because crisis never happens at noon. It's always like 3 in the morning. And we sent him to a facility, a nationally recognized facility. Our insurance covered all but $500 a day. And so a 28, 21, 28, 45 or 90-day stay, an officer's looking to come out of pocket anywhere between $10,000 to $50,000. Now here's the other side of it. We need to have facilities that are first responder savvy. Now imagine sitting in a group, because when you go into inpatient work, you'll be doing group work and you'll be doing individual counseling. So imagine sitting next to somebody and they're like, all right, what's going on with you? Well, I grew up being abused by my mother. I wound up stabbing my stepfather in the face. I started drinking to cover it up, and next thing you know, by the way, I'm getting ready to serve 18 years if I don't complete this program, and my roommate woke me up and I thought it was my mom again, so I stabbed him. Okay, well, thank you. And what's your name? Hi, I'm Chris. I'm a cop. Yeah, it's not that's going to be the most awkward, setting. And in order to get healthy, in order to become sober, to get through the recovery process, you have to be honest. And no cop is going to be honest sitting next to somebody who they find themselves more adversarial.
Other comments?
I just want to add that in terms of research, stress and alcohol abuse are comorbid. They occur a lot And one of our research projects, we looked at that and what the effect was on suicide ideation. And if you had high levels of stress and you had high alcohol use, you had a 10-fold risk of suicide ideation. So all of those things are kind of a nasty triad that people involved in alcohol are at higher risk for suicide as well.
So from what I'm hearing, it sounds like we need to deal with the substance abuse in a bigger context and not just focus on the substance abuse itself.
Yeah, the substance abuse is a result of some underlying trauma or, cumulative trauma, whatever it is. If all we're working on is to get to somebody to stop drinking, we're missing the boat completely. We need to fix it. And the best way I describe it to folks is it's that we have a cup that starts empty and then we put trauma in it and it starts getting filled up a little bit, maybe a big splash, and eventually it starts overflowing. Well, the overflowing is the suicidal ideations. The overflowing is the DUI. You're trying to self-medicate through whatever pharmaceuticals, which I've experienced. So if you just pour it out, yeah, sure, your cup's not overflowing, but how long is it going to take for that cup to get filled up again? So what that involves with the academic side of it and the mental health side of it is dumping that cup out. And that means addressing the underlying trauma. And it's unique for where we are in specific parts of the agency. In other words, There's no, there's a pretty coincidental thing that happens. A lot of like sexual assault investigators have a history. There's a good portion that have a history of being, so understanding that maybe they need to address that before they start, going over the top or falling over.
So I have a couple of comments and suggestions, particularly how to deal with research, and then a question for John Violante. My name is Dr. Steve Bishop. I'm a sergeant with the Dallas Police Department. I've been there right at 29 years now and involved in quite a bit of research on my own in officer mental health and use of force. So that's where these questions are coming from. Anyway, so I'll start with Dan. When you were talking about mindfulness and some of the programs that are going on, I was also going to just let you know or make you aware that the University of Texas of Dallas Brain Centers, Brain Sciences is also doing a lot of work in that area and doing programs with the Dallas Police Department and some other agencies. That might be a resource or somebody to reach out to see what they've done as well. I don't know that if you're aware of that. You can't always be aware of everything going on, but I was just going to tell you that. But I wanted to address a little bit about the resiliency part, and I believe that resiliency, and this is for Chris as well, I think resiliency starts at recruiting. So if we have recruiting measures where we're finding people that are already emotionally healthy, what are they married? Are their relationships going well? What past have they experienced in college? Victims of serious violent crime. I'm not talking about these nixing them out, but this would start the resiliency issue and having people resilient coming into the job in the first place. Next, I think, and Wendy, we talked about this before, that sergeants are probably the most important people when it comes to officer resiliency. I've been a sergeant for 19 years, so I'm particularly focused in this area, but I believe sergeants have probably the biggest impact on whether the officers come to work and want to work, feel like they're supported by supervision. We find that variable consistently in the research, mental health research of stress-related issues with officers, that the relationship with their supervisors is one of the biggest organizational stressors that they're going to come across. But anyway, I wanted to make just some points about resiliency and the mindfulness training, which officers who go to it, even if they are reluctant to go to it, are coming out of it saying, hey, that was some good stuff. I can use that. I wish I'd have had that before. So I'm just repeating your call to that because I think you're right. And I think really, I guess back to John, one of the questions, or one of the things I wanted to ask you to do, if you could talk just a little bit about your study on the life expectancy study, the one I emailed back and forth with you about a while back, because I think that, more than anything else, really hammers home the physiological impact of stress on police officers in the life expectancy of police. I'll cut it off there. I had a bunch of notes, but I'll leave it go at that. But I would like to hear about that and see what you had to say.
Well, the news isn't good. I mean, we have, look at our Buffalo sample. I'll start with that, and then we'll talk more about what we did with that. We did a police mortality cohort, which is a study of a group of police officers from 1950 to 2015. And we looked at this, what officers died from, and so forth and so on. The lifespan for that particular cohort was 68.2 years. Now, the average lifespan for white males, by the way, in the United States is probably around 78, 79, somewhere in that area. So they're dying at a much earlier age, and they're dying more, as I mentioned before, from heart disease and cardiovascular disease-related deaths. The other part of the study compared that sample with the national sample of life expectancy in the United States. And what we found that at various ages, police officers were always at greater risk for dying than was the general population. Example, between the ages of 50 and 55, they had a 40% greater chance of dying than did the average citizen in the United States. As they got older, of course, they had a greater chance of dying. But the really interesting thing about that is that the younger officers had an increase of dying over the people in the general population and dying of cardiovascular disease. So what causes a young person to have a heart attack or having some sort of a cardiovascular malfunction? Well, again, lifestyle, stress. You know, police officers putting up with this stuff, what they put up with every day. Now, policing, the stress in policing is only one factor. You know, what does that affect? It affects your diet, it affects your health, it affects your sleep, it affects your life. So all of these things together decrease the life expectancy of police officers. How do you stop that? Well, again, wellness issues are important. Getting people well, getting officers well, training them to be well. How to sleep, how to eat, how to deal with stress, use mindfulness, use yoga, use what you want, but my gosh, take care of it. But yeah, it's unfortunate that they die at an earlier age than the general population.
Hi, Caitlin Thompson with Cohen Veterans Network, and prior to my work there, I oversaw the suicide prevention program for the Department of Veterans Affairs. And I'm really interested in hearing, Major Stiver, about your experience in terms of being a veteran, as well as just what research is being done for our veterans who are also going into law enforcement. I know that there are so many similarities: the sleep deprivation, the family difficulties, the substance abuse, et cetera, et cetera. So what is being done right now to better understand that, and just overall, what are your thoughts in terms of the overlaps? Thank you.
So I was in the Army in the 90s before a lot of the changes happened after 9/11 that led to increases in deployments and things like that in the military. And a lot of my friends who are still in the military have been deployed 5, 6, 7 times, or just even being deployed once when I was in the military was rare. And in some of my exploration here, what I found is that the military, and when we talked about family support, the military already had kind of some of those concepts built in terms of taking care of soldiers and their families or airmen and their families. And I, as a kid growing up in the Air Force, we were very well cared for. And my dad deployed. My dad went on unaccompanied assignments and was gone. And so we had great support networks that were already there back in the 70s, to give away my age. But and then kind of about 5 years after the invasion of Iraq, the military really started looking hard at resiliency and how to build more resilient workforces, because suicide numbers were going up, and they were noticing the need to improve on the systems that were already there. And I think that's what we're seeing in policing now. And I think some of it is coming over, and we're learning, or we have the ability to learn from some of the things that the military has done to build. There's a whole Air Force Office of Resiliency. They've got a whole group of people that are working on this. And so the challenge is going to be building that into the operational structures of police departments at a time when we're struggling to recruit. We're struggling to meet our operational commitments. And I can tell you that when it comes to doing research and bringing that back into our agencies, one of the biggest challenges is that nobody has the capacity, because any kind of project is viewed as a threat to operational resources. So we take a police officer away from policing to work on a project that might help us out in the long run, but we're taking a police officer away from policing. And I think that's one of the big challenges. But I have seen where the VA and the military have been looking very closely at studying suicide and the impact on both active military members and veterans. And that's a huge part of our recruiting pool. We're bringing in a lot of people from the military into policing, so the better work that you're doing in the VA and the better work they're doing in the military may have some impacts on what we see in policing as we move forward.
Just on a related note, a quick follow-up. One of the teachers who teaches our mindfulness classes, Chris, does a lot of teaching and coaching inside the VA too, and made me aware of this whole health initiative that the VA has been rolling out, which is really a philosophical shift that puts the individual and health promotion at the center of healthcare as opposed to disease management, and is a personalized approach that integrates a lot of things we've been talking about, mindfulness, sleep hygiene, nutrition, relationships, spirituality, but is really person-centered and asks the veteran what matters most to you and how can we develop an individualized plan of health to promote those things that matter to them. So I think it's something for law enforcement, if they're not already looking at it, to take a look at this model.
Right.
I think
Oh, yeah, please, go ahead.
I just wanted to add that I think one of the important things to consider is the reintegration of people coming back from war, from Afghanistan, into police work. If they were officers when they left and they went to war and they came back, there's quite an adjustment coming back to the job of being a cop again. And, you know, things are different on the streets of Baghdad than they are on the streets of Detroit. Well, it's close, but, you know, but, you know, they're different and different modes of dealing with people. And so there needs to be a reintegration process, and I think most departments are doing that. A retraining, a lot having to do with driving and shooting and everything has to kind of be learned all over again because the military way of doing things in combat is quite different.
Great, thank you for this panel. It's been really informative and excellent. I'm Dr. Lester Andrus, Director of the Public Safety Leadership Administration program, new professional master's program at the University of Maryland. And we have this focus on leadership for law enforcement and other public safety officials. And I just wanted to ask from any or all of you, you know, if you had one suggestion for changing organization or culture, just one implementation, something that we can implement. I think I think that's a huge question, but I think it's a really important one, other than just sort of rounding up people in a classroom and saying, you know, this is important. Is there something that, you know, you've thought about that could make that change?
I do a lot of speaking at different universities, and it's always interesting when you come across like a criminal justice major or something like that, who knows everything. I think the best thing you could do, and what helps any organization or you know, people learning about it, is to be honest. Here's the bad part: being honest about what we do isn't always pretty. You know, everybody. There's that big joke. Everybody wants to be a lion until it's time to do lion stuff, and then it gets pretty ugly. I spoke, a friend of mine here, doctor who's over here at Old Dominion University, and we used to repeatedly go there. And I would tell them about the struggles. I would tell them about how hard it was to deal with certain things that I saw and how that stress affected me and doing investigations. You know, when we deal with, you know, we talk about how many children can you see physically, sexually molested to the point where they need hospitalization? I mean, how many times can you see that before you're starting to get this distaste for what humanity does to you? And again, it's just cumulative on top. That's just one thing on top of 13 others. If we allow ourselves to be real and understand that, hey, we have problems on our end, until we start recognizing that, we're not going to change anything. You know, because and go to any agency. I always ask. You know, I said, hey, how many drunks do you have in your agency? And they're like, oh, we have a couple. No, you don't. No, you don't. You know, how many of your folks have thought about suicide? You know, well, you know, not that many. No, it's a lot. I'm here to tell you, we have to be okay with saying it, I think, ultimately.
Yeah. I think when you talk about changing the culture, I mean, that's a really, really huge order. But there are a couple of things there. One is I had the privilege to go down to Columbia, South Carolina, and meet with some folks at the Richland County Sheriff's Office. And Sheriff Leon Lott there has done some pretty impressive things with changing the perception of that agency when it comes to the stigma of PTSD and the things that his people have encountered. And he let me sit in a room with these folks and just listen to their stories all day. And they were very patient and kind and giving in that way. But they made it very clear, we talk about this, and we talk about this openly with everybody in the agency when they come in the front door, and so that's kind of helped to change the way they perceive it. I think the other thing, and the other big thing, is diversifying our agencies. And not just bringing in people of different cultures and backgrounds and races and expecting them to conform to the organizational culture, but allowing them to bring their own culture into the agency. And my agency just graduated from the academy, one of our first African immigrant officers. And it was a big day for us, and it was a big day for him, but he brings a whole different, he's from Burundi, he brings a whole different culture and different ideas to the agency, and I think we don't just expect him to conform, but celebrate what he brings to the table. In the United States, we're looking at an average of about 12.5% women in police agencies, right? And we know that women bring different cultural perspectives into this job that can help change the way we think about things. So I think that's really, really important. We've been working on it for a while, just in broad terms of diversifying our agencies, and it needs a lot more work because there's not a whole lot of research on how to do it better and what works and what doesn't.
Thanks. We're running out of time, and I want to give the last few people a chance to ask questions. So,
hi, my name is Elizabeth Mumford. I'm with NORC at the University of Chicago, based here in Maryland. And I want to just take this opportunity to thank NIJ and some people in the room who supported a national level study of agencies and officers in terms of safety and wellness. So we have collected the agency level data. We've closed the cross-sectional first wave of the officer data, and we got additional NIJ funding to follow up. We're really hoping to expand the sample. It's a challenge to get, we have the right statisticians, so we have really good weights and stuff like that, but it's a challenge to get agencies and officers to participate in these studies where we're asking a lot of sensitive questions at the national level, but we're specifically doing this to bring this data to the table, to raise awareness in administrative meetings and municipal funding conversations about what the extent of PTSD is, what the extent of resilience is in the officer population, how many of them are coming from the military, and what are they dealing with in their personal lives. So I wanted to put that out there and to ask if anybody is interested to please reach out to me, because we certainly would welcome inputs on my own. I've also studied a lot of trauma-informed care in the last 5 years. I will stand up like I'm at an AA meeting. I come from a history of suicidality, so I'm really sensitive to these topics and making sure that we all feel comfortable talking about it. I was on a panel with CNA about 3 months ago, and what was raised was the issue of the stigma. If you have something like this on your record, you can't retire with your weapon. And I wondered if anybody wanted to comment on this, because this really, hadn't heard of this before, and this really shocks me that we're facing this insoluble situation of somebody feeling a need to retire with a weapon, but fearing that putting anything on their record is going to stop that.
Yeah, that's a big issue, you know. As far as retirement with your weapon, that's a new one. But reaching out for help will, and this is where the problem is from the top down. If I reach out for help and I say I have an issue, I'm drinking, I can't control it, I need help. Depending on, most agencies are fairly small. We're not dealing with large agencies, but I'm not getting transferred to any specialty assignment because I'm a drunk, right? There is no concept of somebody being in recovery. And when somebody's in recovery and they slip, relapse, that's part of the recovery process. They're penalized for it. They're penalized for it. So we don't get help because our agencies, no, we would never, listen, we want to help our officers. That guy will never work in traffic. It's like talking out of the side of their mouth, right? So that's why you get a lot of people doing that. And as far as the gun thing, what I've seen happen is that somebody voluntarily go to get help. And then while they're receiving help, it becomes involuntary. And depending on what state you're in, like for example, Virginia, if you're involuntarily held at a facility, you can't have a gun anymore. So it's not about even having a job anymore. You're not, that's done, it's over. But different states have different things.
All right. I'm sorry, but I just got a sign that we have to wrap up. So I think we're going to have to close off questions. I was asked to do a wrap up on this, and I have to say there's far too much that's been talked about for me to do that. What I will do in closing is reference for all of you the fact that NIJ has on its website a strategic research plan for safety and wellness in this area. I think a fair amount of what we talked about today is covered in that. I think there are some holes that were pointed out today which are interesting that we'll have to think about. But I encourage you to look at that, and we're certainly open to feedback from any of you if you review it and have any thoughts about it. So on that note, I want to thank our panelists. They're totally wonderful. Thank you.